Hello, Nash. Hello, Isabel. Now that David's here, we can start. Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're going to start a series of talks on Shunyata, on emptiness, as the Buddha teaches emptiness. The timing is such that those of us that are going on retreat, this is a good lead-in to be mindful of the whole point of the Buddha's teachings is to empty ourselves of ignorance, to be empty of clinging to wrong views. Just hold in mind, and those of you that aren't going on retreat, you can just listen along. You'll gain something from it too. These are three important suttas. It gets to the heart of the Buddha's teachings. And there's also, and I'll mention this as we go along, some contradictions between what has developed since the Buddha's passing in modern Buddhism and their application of mindfulness. And that'll become much more clear. But again, the Buddha didn't teach emptiness as an environment to aspire to, or some place to establish a self in, which is really just another subtle form of eye-making. It's simply in a direct way to, as I said before, to empty ourselves of ignorance, and very specific ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And the Buddha would spend 45 years of his teaching career, his entire life after his awakening, teaching to do just that. So we'll meditate first. So find your relaxed meditative posture. Eyes and gently close your mouths. I hear someone coming up, so let's just let them come up. And at least I thought I did.
Yeah.
How's everybody doing in temperature-wise? You guys cold or good?
It's nice.
Yeah.
Hello, Mary. So find your relaxed meditative posture. Gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And holding your back straight, but not stiff. Your ears aligned with your shoulders. The nose aligned with your navel. And holding yourself very loosely, very gently, very lovingly. Allow yourselves to settle into this room. Settle onto your seats. Settle into your bodies. And settle into your minds. And take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body. For what that's like. To be mindful of your breath in your body. And while remaining mindful of your breath in your body, notice that thoughts are flowing. We're conscious beings, thoughts should be flowing. The purpose of meditation is to not be distracted by your own thoughts. So when you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. I'll repeat that. When you find that you're caught up in your thinking again, simply acknowledge that and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. Relaxing your thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. And we'll meditate for 20 minutes with callbacks every 5 minutes. Relaxing thoughts, remaining mindful of your breathing. 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 If a persistent thought or feeling arises, stay with it for a moment or two. Recognize it as impermanent and return your mindfulness to the sensation of breathing. And we'll meditate for 5 more minutes. Take a moment to notice the quality of your mind. Be at peace with your mind. And when you're ready, you can gently open your eyes. Hello, Vicky. Hello, Charlemagne.
Sorry, everybody. I won't bring her anymore. She's too distracting. We'll take a vote tonight.
I'll talk to you after class.
Okay.
So I'm going to cite 3 suttas on emptiness. The Kula Sanata, Sanata means emptiness. The Maha, or the greater talk on emptiness, and then the Kakayana Sutta, to Kakayana. They're all around the same theme. And just to put it into context, the Buddha awakened to dependent origination, which states from ignorance through 12 observable causative links, all manner of confusion, deluded thinking, and suffering arises. And it's a very specific type of ignorance. It's ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And so the Buddha's very first teaching was that teaching on the Four Noble Truths, and then everything he taught for the next 45 years of his teaching career was taught in the context of Four Noble Truths and in the context of dependent origination and developing an understanding or wisdom where there was once ignorance. Right? To be empty of ignorance. And that really is the whole purpose of the Buddha's teachings, emptiness in that way, not some grand scheme of as an environment. While the Buddha was wandering around northern India seeking enlightenment, seeking awakening, he studied with 2 very prominent teachers, Alara Kalama and Udeka Ramaputta, and they both taught variations on what was found in the Vedas, the precursor to modern Hinduism. And none of what I'm saying is to disparage Hinduism. It's just what happened. The Buddha studied with both of those teachers. He mastered their teaching very quickly. In fact, both of the teachers asked the Buddha to join them and be their representative, be their main teacher out in the world. Alara Kalama taught this meditation method that develops a mental quality of nothingness. And Udeka Ramaputta taught a meditation method that develops a mental quality of neither perception nor non-perception. And it almost sounds a little ridiculous to say it, but that idea of neither perception nor non-perception, and even the idea of a mental quality of nothingness, is a strategy to create a non-dual doctrine where we can reconcile everything into one single thing. Which is completely contrary to what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught to see everything in its discreteness, not to reconcile everything into one tight little package that everything is interconnected and interdependent. That contradicts everything the Buddha taught. So the Buddha rejected both of those teachings and both of those teachers and continued to seek awakening. And eventually he came to the understanding that it is ignorance of Four Noble Truths that leads to all manner of suffering. So that's what he taught. Let me just read a little bit from the article, and I'll get to the first sutta. Much of the later developed Buddhist schools treat emptiness and nothingness as a mystical environment to be realized, where all Dharma contradictions can be reconciled. What is often overlooked in the customary use of emptiness is, I got to ask Lauren, am I reading too quickly? Tell me if I am.
If you get onto the clever stuff, yeah, that's too clever.
It's all clever stuff. What do you mean?
I mean, the more technical, the more stuff you have to pay more detail, so that's too clever.
Yeah, if I'm just tell me to slow down anyway, please.
Yeah.
What? I remember that. Thinking of that great Taxi where they're getting on Jim Agnew. What does a yellow light mean? Slow down. What is often overlooked in the customary use of emptiness is that this adapted use of emptiness now becomes the repository for what has been avoided by ignoring the Four Noble Truths. In other words, a incredible strategy to continue to ignore ignorance is now utilizing this mystical environment of emptiness and just putting everything that you can't develop an understanding of in there and say this is now the Dhamma. And of course, there's no understanding of Four Noble Truths when you do that. This adapted application of emptiness then provides a conceptual acceptance through avoidance that allows for continued ignorance. All that can't be logically reconciled from this initial ignorance is now labeled emptiness or nothingness. Meaning a lot of the non-dual teachings now claim that there's no such thing as a self, which is not anything that Buddha ever taught. He never said there's no such thing as a self. He just said that the views that we hold of a self are wrong views. Let go of the views. That's also a subtle form of asceticism and annihilation. The Buddha practiced severe forms of asceticism, but if you look at a non-dual doctrine, it's also a form of asceticism because it's denying the existence of a self. Remember, the Buddha taught the Eightfold Path as a middle way between these extreme views. Between the extreme view of complete sensory indulgence and the other extreme of complete self-denial, which is also this idea of no such thing as a self. Is that clear? It's an important point. And it's not just that this is what set the Buddha apart from a lot of modern Buddhism. This teaching is what set the Buddha apart from every other teaching that came before. It's the one defining characteristic. This conceptual application, rooted in wrong view, then allows for ignorance of the three marks of existence, of anicca, anatta, and dukkha, impermanence, the not self characteristic, and the resulting suffering. The three marks of existence describe the ever-changing environment in which wrong views of self arise, seeking to establish a permanent self-identity. This self-establishment is both unreasonable and impossible. The result is ongoing confusion, ongoing deluded thinking, and ongoing disappointing and unsatisfactory experiences. Again, the whole point is then to empty yourself of that ignorance that would cause you to not understand the impermanent environment in which we're establishing a self based on wrong views. For those new to Buddhism or anyone confused by modern dharmas, it is important to recognize and acknowledge these significant differences so that the purpose and foundation of the Buddhist teachings is clearly understood. There is nothing skillful in attempting to reconcile the many contradictory forms of modern Buddhism into one hybridized individual or group Buddhist practice when a misapplication or ignorance of the Four Noble Truths is the result. Continued ignorance can only continue ignorance. The modern conceptual applications of emptiness are themselves originating in ignorance of dependent origination. Often in the Paticca Vibhanga Sutta, the sutta that teaches dependent origination, among many others, is altered or completely ignored in order to allow for the modern concepts of interdependence, interconnectedness, and interbeing. It is this initial ignorance of dependent origination that allows for the contradictory modern applications of emptiness and the many modern contradictory Buddhist practices that follow from that. Is that also clear? This points to the notion of a non-dual doctrine being something that is itself rooted in ignorance, that we need to reconcile everything into one kind of unified Buddhist view, and how it contradicts what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught to see everything in its discrete form. It doesn't mean that there's not an underlying factor to simply having a human life, but it doesn't. It has no real meaning to awakening, to what the Buddha taught. We're all connected in some way. We all have physical bodies. We breathe the same air. Carl Sagan used to say we're all made of star stuff. We are, and there is that connection that we all have. That's great. We're connected to each other. We're connected to oranges. It doesn't mean anything as it relates to awakening. What's important is to recognize wrong view and the wrong views we've used to establish a self. And a teaching that would say, well, then establish yourself into this grand cosmic oneness is just more eye-making, isn't it? Does everybody see that? It's establishing yourself in some conceptual framework where we're all one grand cosmic being. Sounds nice. Maybe it's true, but it's not something that's useful as far as awakening. You know, we may all find one day that we are one grand organism. I don't think that's going to happen, but as far as what the Buddha is teaching, it's important to simply recognize wrong views rooted in ignorance. Nash?
Just to make sure I'm not continuing my own ignorance, could you give me a quick explanation what a non-dual doctrine is? Is that kind of like a different word for dogma?
Yeah, it could be. A non-dual doctrine seeks to, it's even hard for me to explain, even though it's common. A non-dual doctrine reconciles all contradictory and competing wrong views into one conceptual sphere of unknowing. All the things that we cannot explain, and the Buddha would say that these things that we can't explain, we should just completely ignore. But a non-dual doctrine seeks to reconcile all these things that we can't explain into one kind of thing called nothingness or emptiness, and that we should aspire to that. And we should place ourselves into this sphere of emptiness or no self. Some of the non-dual doctrines are approached in a little bit of a different way.
That would be the Buddhist non-dual, because the Hinduist non-dual comes at it from a different direction altogether.
Yep, and the Advaita is almost a hybridized form of all of it, isn't it? The Buddhist non-dual doctrines have more akin to the teachings of Alara Kalama and Udekta Ramaputta, meaning the Vedas, that which the Buddha taught, than what the Buddha actually taught. And there's always this, I don't want to get too far off base. It's an aspect of a self-referential ego self that seeks to reconcile everything that it comes across into a self-referential view. In other words, to see itself in everything that occurs. That's how a anatta, that's how a self-referential ego self, that's how conditioned thinking continues to condition itself. It sees itself in everything. And so it creates these marvelous strategies to do just that, including in so-called spirituality or in Buddhist teachings. You see yourself in everything. If you look at what, and I just referenced the 3 marks of existence, what the Buddha ultimately teaches is that it's not that there's no such thing as a self. There's no such thing as a permanent self, and to recognize that the self is always in a constant process of becoming. And so that leads directly to the question, the important question is, what am I going to become? In this moment, if I'm free of a non-dual doctrine, free of trying to reconcile myself into everything in existence, which, by the way, takes away most of my responsibility, instead of recognizing that in this moment, I'm in charge of what I am and who I am, and what am I going to become? If my thinking is, if my mind is well concentrated and my thinking is well framed by the Eightfold Path, in this moment, I'm moving towards becoming awakened. And if I'm stuck in a doctrine that continues ignorance, the only thing I can do is continue to become more ignorant. So, a long way around to get to this point, a non-dual doctrine is a very good strategy for continuing ignorance. You can make, physics can prove that there's connections between all things in the universe. It's not a doctrine for as far as it's useful for awakening. Did I explain that? Did I explain it to everyone well enough? Non-duality? Okay. Let me just continue reading a little bit more. This modern confusing doctrine hopes to show that all things, including all human beings, are infinitely interdependent, constantly interconnected, and can only thrive through interbeing. It is in this amorphous and interdependent soup that somehow reconciles in the doctrine of emptiness All things are interdependent, interconnected, and interbe, and so empty of a separate existence. And that's where the non-dual doctrine gets introduced. That since we are all interconnected, we are empty of any type of separate existence. But again, look at the eye-making in that. And that's really not the point of what the Buddha's teaching. It's not a similar teaching. That's just a little bit off. It's a completely contradictory teaching. It doesn't relate at all to what the Buddha taught. I'm spending a lot of time and effort on something that if somebody asked that question of the Buddha, he would likely just sit there to show that the question itself doesn't even really deserve an answer. And I'm not talking about your question. This whole notion, it doesn't even, because it can only reinforce, if you go too far, it can only reinforce ignorance. So let me get to the suttas too. Let me go back to this. So the Buddha did not teach to see oneself in everything and to see everything as oneself. The Buddha taught that everything in the phenomenal world is discrete and carries those three marks of existence. The Buddha awakened to the profound understanding that the common human problem of greed, aversion, and deluded thinking arose from ignorance, not from recognizing our own interdependence. The Buddha didn't awaken and teach dependent origination, saying that all things are interdependent, and so because we don't recognize that, somebody taught. He taught from ignorance of Four Noble Truths, all manner of suffering arises. It has nothing to do with interdependence or not interdependence. It has to do with what we need to understand in order to awaken. All right, let me go. So the Kulasanata Sutta, the Lesser Discourse on Emptiness. The Buddha was at Savatthi, the eastern monastery, a local palace. The Buddha's chief attendant and cousin, Ananda, returning from seclusion, asked the Buddha, "On one occasion I heard you say, 'I now remain fully dwelling in the quality of mind of emptiness.' Did I hear this correctly? Did I learn this correctly? Did I remember this correctly?" The Buddha replied, "Yes, Ananda, you heard that correctly. You learned it correctly, and you remembered it correctly. Now as before, I remain fully dwelling in emptiness. Just as this place is empty of elephants and cattle and empty of gold or silver, empty of assemblies of women and men, there is only this non-emptiness of this community of monks. Even so, Ananda, when not distracted by the perception of the village, the perception of a human being, there is only mindfulness of a wilderness with no distractions to what is not present," meaning there is no discursive or speculative thought. The Buddha is taking a kind of a roundabout way to saying, I'm present with whatever is present. I'm not putting any I into it. I'm not perceiving it in any different way. I'm simply here with what's occurring. The Buddha continues, "The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of wilderness. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of wilderness." So I'll explain that. Wilderness is metaphor for the pleasant abiding in the samadhi, or non-distracted state, free of the distraction of craving for and clinging to the mundane objects of the village or in the immediate surroundings. Elephants and cattle, gold or silver, assemblies of men or women. He's just, again, saying, I'm not attached to any of this. Just like if we were in a wilderness, a true wilderness, there wouldn't be anybody else there, would be. There'd be nothing else for us to engage with. That's the Buddha's using that metaphor of the wilderness to see that way. Even though he's in a population of people, he's not attached to those people in any way. There's nothing that he's using in a self-referential way. Is that clear? So he's empty of clinging thoughts. And those clinging thoughts are what arises from ignorance. That's how he's describing emptiness to Ananda. Clear? Lorna?
Yes.
The subheading here is emptiness of the perception of the village. It is then understood, the Buddha continues, it is then understood that whatever disturbances that would arise from being distracted by the things of the village are no longer present. In other words, and prior to his awakening, he may be, and we all are, disturbed. There's an agitation in our mind by the things of the village. And we all know that, correct? Things occur that agitates our mind. We might be elated over something. That's an agitation. We might be deeply disturbed over something. We might be full of fear. It's an agitation in the mind.
If we want them or we don't want them.
Yes. And so what the Buddha is describing to Ananda is simply being mindfully present with what occurs without the distinction or the need for it to be any different than what is occurring. Whatever disturbances that would arise from being distracted by the perception of a permanent human being are no longer present. So what does the Buddha mean by that? Meaning a self-established permanent being. This is who I am. These are my views. This is what I need from life. This is what I don't need. This is what I must avoid. This is what I must have. Those are all views that come from a perceived permanent self. Because if it wasn't a perceived permanent self, there'd be no reason to create these hardened views of this is what I need and this is what I need to avoid. Would there be? If the self is always and seen accurately in a constant process of becoming, then each moment is a mindful and meaningful possibility to see something in a new way. It might be that same old piece of chocolate cake, but without the clinging view of how it should be, we can taste it anew. A silly example that I use often. Am I clear about where I'm going and the Buddha's going here? If we're empty of clinging to wrong views and empty of ignorance of how to see the world, every moment is a fresh moment. Right? There's no condition me to see this moment in any certain way. I'm simply present with what's occurring. And how do we do that? That's almost a hard thing to conceptualize. How could I have a mind that is that fresh and pure each moment? Pretty hard to think of that, isn't it? Except it just means that mind is not holding on to any type of view.
It's empty of what's not there.
Empty of what's not there.
How do you maintain relationships in that context? Like before, when you said attachment and clinging, like can any attachment be good?
See you, Matt.
Does all attachments have to be clinging? I mean, how do you fall in love? How do you have a best friend? How do you have any type of relationship if there's no attachment?
Yeah, and it's an ongoing, continual commitment without any fabricated structure. I'll just give you a practical example. Years and years ago, I had a friend and a teacher. He's still around. I think he's in his 90s now. His name was Arnold Patton. And his wife, Selma, they were married just about, I'm trying to remember because we had a celebration. They were married just about 40 years. So they were both in their early 60s at this time. Anyway, they always made a point because they made the point because when you looked at these two people, you knew that they were in love even after all those years. They were just delighted in each other's presence even after all those years. And they always made the point that every day they recommitted themselves to each other. They didn't need a long-term contract. And they were both of the mind that if at any point they didn't want this to continue, they were free to go. And they're still together today. So we don't need structure, we don't need clinging, we don't need agreements. In fact, they can often hurt us. I'm not saying, and don't take this too far. Remember extreme views. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have certain agreements. That's how the world works. But by clinging to something, remember the Buddha taught how to recognize and abandon or understand suffering. By me clinging myself, using your example, to a certain relationship, at that point, I'm setting myself up for suffering and probably confusion and deluded thinking, aren't I? Because all things are impermanent. And it may just be the most important, the thing that's immediately important is the most important relationship in my life. And if I'm clinging to it, if I need it for my survival, it's going to be devastating when that particular relationship ends. That doesn't mean that you can't be completely involved with someone and completely committed without clinging and attachment. Look at Arnold and Selma Patton. Is that clear?
I think so.
So we think, and this really gets to the heart of the matter, emptiness of clinging. We think we need to attach ourselves to everything that we want to keep and claim that as mine. And we need to identify the things that we need to avoid and claim those as mine too. We attach ourselves to those things that we don't want by creating an identity. Such as, I couldn't stand if this person ever left me. Well, it might happen. And if that happens, a mindful person would probably feel sad. They might feel devastated. They'll feel everything that is appropriate and skillful to feel in the moment. The difference is between that person and an unawakened person is they won't have any need for that to be any different. And even that makes something as devastating as a loss of a relationship meaningful in a certain way. Why? How could you even see it as meaningful? Because it's what happens in life. You remember how the Buddha described suffering? Sickness, aging, death. Birth, sickness, aging, and death is suffering. Not getting what you want. Getting what you don't want is all suffering. And then he would conclude it by saying, in short, the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. It's a personal experience of suffering. So in that way, when we put conditions on our life and condition our mind that life should be a certain way, we're setting ourselves up for continued confusion, deluded thinking, and suffering. When we free our minds, when we empty ourselves of the ignorance that causes that clinging, I'm free, calm, and at peace no matter what's occurring. That's true mindfulness rooted in concentration, isn't it? Quality of mind that I just described it. Do you all feel that's possible?
Some days.
Frank?
My wife and I just had this conversation on Saturday. We were up here having dinner about when you depend on somebody else to make you happy. That creates like this possessiveness and very unhealthy structure in a relationship. And each person can independently be a whole person without the other one, and then kind of, happiness arises when you're together, arises when you're apart.
Yeah, and when there's clinging, I mean, I think probably every one of us has been in a relationship at one time or another where the clinging was just suffocating, wasn't it?
Well, I think attachment kind of like gets interwoven with greed and like that possessiveness and control, and I don't see anything healthy about it. And I've had attachments in my life that letting go of attachments is probably one of the hardest things for the heart to do. Letting the attachment let go of you. You know what I mean? And you reframe it through understanding what's happening.
Yes, exactly. And so do you see how an understanding of impermanence is so important to all of this and really letting go of attachment? Because if you recognize that all things are impermanent, including, now we're talking about intimate, important relationships, but even recognizing that those are potentially impermanent helps free you from clinging. And it enables both of you to have a healthy kind of separation there. You're not so totally enmeshed in each other's lives. Judy?
To answer your question about do we think that it's possible to have a mind that's peaceful and that's a sticking point with me, only because when you have something happen to you and you feel all the emotions and then you move through that, at that time you obviously do not have that kind of mind. But how I understand it is that if you have the understanding to step back and look at what you're going through at the time and say, wow, this really sucks, but it's not forever, I'll get
Yes.
through it. Is that what you're talking about, is having that mindset? Because,
Yep, to be at peace with a less than peaceful mind state.
okay,
To understand that it's appropriate to feel
yeah,
this way in this moment, whatever's occurring.
well, I think that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really is, it kind of points back to the Vitakka Sutta. We gain the ability to think what we want to think, when we want to think it, and it's appropriate to think this way. So a long-standing relationship ends, the person comes home and said, that's it, I'm done. You'd probably be sad, you might be afraid of the future. Those are all appropriate things. But you don't get caught up in it shouldn't be any different. You don't start blaming the other person. You don't start blaming what's wrong with me. How could they do this? You're simply present with what's occurring. And imagine how much easier it will be to move through whatever you need to go through if you have that mindset, rather than something that's reactive. And I don't want to go too far with that. But Greg, you had a question?
I just want to contribute real quickly about the relationship thing. I had kind of a epiphany when I should have been focusing on my breath, meditating one day. I was thinking about my wife and how we kind of, this attitude of, I said to her, I love you like an appendage, which sounds weird, but it made perfect sense to me. And it's like, I can live without you. I don't, need you to survive, as often exchanged between partners. And the same kind of goes for my partner.
I'm sorry, Antonio, you can put the lid down. You can sit right on that.
You wouldn't just, chop it off. You're not better off without it. It's something that's there. It's a relationship that formed, and you're not going to go out of your way to, cut yourself off from it. It's beneficial. It's, so just the idea of, thinking it was a weird thought, like an appendage. Like you wouldn't just intentionally get rid of it or ruin it and separate yourself, deny yourself it. If it's, it's natural and that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. You wouldn't cut off the appendage just to prove you don't need it.
Right.
It's there.
Nor would you have false expectations for the appendage.
Yeah.
And you
Again,
so this is my arm, I love it, but if something comes and is falling, you're going to move it.
Yeah, or if the arm gets diseased in some way, then you might mindfully say, okay, it's time to keep. And it brings to mind the good description of what awakening means: full human maturity. Someone who is fully mature wouldn't cut off an appendage just to show that they don't need it. They wouldn't end a relationship just to show how independent they are. You wouldn't even have that thought. You would be mindfully present with life as life occurs. Mary, did you have a question?
With the expectation piece, that I remember being on the retreat, and Jen and Laura were my roommates, and I was like, we're not supposed to have expectations. For hours, I was like, relationship, not an expectation. So it was funny, but there's a lot of other nuances and other words that go along with that. So, you mentioned like the flip side of blaming someone, or the role your spouse or partner is supposed to play in life or in your home. All those different kind of things that we're led to believe, or we think that's, or even as, I've contributed things like as a mother, my role as a mother, my expectations for myself, my children, that only brings suffering. If you had the freedom to let that all just, that's where I think you find true love between whether it's your children or a spouse or a friend or whatever, in the ability to, and that's where that word dispassion is kind of a funny word. Because, loving a spouse or something is supposed to be passionate, but it's not all the time. And it's not most of the time. So it's in those moments of being that if you had more of those in your life and less of the blame and expectations and striving and creating and becoming, I think that's what true love is. Or
Yeah, and that idea of expectations, and shouldn't we have expectations of our spouse or our children or our parents? That's even looking at it the wrong way. We all have responsibilities. It doesn't, being a fully mature human being doesn't mean you have no responsibilities. It means that you take your responsibility seriously. And so, and we do make agreements. My wife says she's going to be home at 6 o'clock. I expect her to be there. But if she's not, frying pan.
right.
You know, because I understand that things happen in the world. And again, I'm using kind of a silly example, but I mean, it does happen. So we have maybe a better word for expectations is we have a responsibility towards consistency, towards what we're putting out there. People have a right. Yeah.
It's not just what we're doing.
And maybe that's even a wrong word, a right, but that's a mature way of living in the world. And the reason why I'm saying this is I know that there's people that look at this type of teaching and say, well, I don't have to worry about anything. There's no such thing as, this is that non-dual, there's no such thing as a self. I don't have a responsibility. I can do anything I want. Well, that's an extreme view, isn't it? An awakened, fully mature, fully mindful person, responsible to right speech, right action, and right livelihood 100% of the time, without the need to be confined by it. It's simply a natural expression of who they are. Why? Because they're empty of ignorance. They're incapable of acting in any hurtful way towards themselves or others. Frank, you had a question or comment?
No, earlier I was just thinking about how the four truths, coming in here not knowing anything about them and trying to understand them intellectually, I guess over the course of the last few months, with the way life has been showing up in my life, I can see my own personal suffering, and that's not even really a good word for it. The extremes of that lineage of suffering. How why the path is there, and feeling my own personal experience with it, with every single truth, and seeing where my attachments are, and remaining in right view, and practicing right intention, and using, continuing my practice with meditation and recollecting, the experiences and what's going on with me and feeling it personally. I don't know. I can. I really had a lot of personal experience with dukkha.
Yeah.
A few months.
Yeah, and you're gaining an understanding of it.
And I can feel the release of that pain.
Yeah.
Letting go of attachments. It's almost like feeling like in the grips of something and then feeling it like ungrip and feeling the release.
Yeah. The release of clinging. True.
The concept that I can't love anything that I need saved my life.
Yeah, I relate that to a lot of different things, huh?
Including life itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, you're getting to the heart of the matter. The Buddha teaches we should not be so enamored with life even. Life is an incredible experience. It's amazing. But we shouldn't be attached to any of it or enamored with it or enamored with our thoughts about life. We should simply be with life as life occurs. Like Kandana said when he awakened, all conditioned things that arise are subject to cessation. Why would we want to hang on to anything that's impermanent? Entities over anything that's impermanent. The Buddha consistently said to recognize in all things that we start attaching ourselves to remind ourselves, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not myself. Why? Because if we don't do that, if we keep creating strategies to attach ourselves to everything, We're just setting ourselves up for confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing disappointing experiences. A less than peaceful mind. Let me get back to the sutta. Try to finish at least one tonight. The Buddha continues, there is only this non-emptiness of the perception of the wilderness. It is seen as being empty of what is not there, meaning empty of disturbance by external self-identification, by being empty of ignorance. What is present is seen as there is only this. This is the entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and is undistorted and pure. And what, remember that sutta, I can't think of it right now. And what is seen, there is only what is seen, and what is heard, there is only the mindfulness of the hear. And what is cognized, there is only what is cognized. Think about that. And Matt and Lorna we had this little discussion about our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our touch, our smell. If they're not used for self-referential ideas, they're just part of that process of having a human body, just like our heart is pumping blood and our liver is filtering what it's supposed to be doing. Our sense organs should act in just the same way, but when we're coming at life from a self-referential view, we start picking apart. I like that. I don't like that. I got to avoid this. The eye-making is through the senses. Remember, in dependent origination, it talks about that. At the sixth sense base, at contact with the sixth sense base becomes craving. From craving becomes clinging and maintaining. It's all is rooted in ignorance. And what is seen is only what is seen. And what is tasted, there's only what is tasted. It doesn't mean that we might taste something that is incredible. Liberty Hall pizza. We don't need any more of it. And our life is fine with it or without it. We don't create conditions on our life in any way. We don't fall in love with what we need. Why? Because we don't need anything. The Buddha taught that I shouldn't say that, we qualified. The Buddha said we need food, shelter, medicine, and clothing. But those are very simple, basic things to acquire. With identities over those types of things, we get into trouble. No, we set ourselves, I shouldn't say we get into trouble. We set ourselves up for disappointment if we don't have a lot of food or the right clothes or the right house or even the right medicine. Let me continue with this. I said I was going to finish this tonight.
John, would you turn down the air conditioning?
Let me go back that one sentence. This is the entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and is undistorted and pure. My words. The Buddha here is describing initial emptiness from the withdrawal of self-identification with the things of the local environment. The mind is calm and at peace, empty of disturbance arising from sensory stimulation rooted in wrong view. This relates directly to dependent origination, meaning when this isn't, that isn't. When ignorance isn't there, deluded thinking and suffering doesn't arise through that chain of dependencies. The Buddha continues. Now the Buddha talked about to the local environment. Right? Now he's going to take it out a little further. Furthermore, Nanda, as concentration increases within the framework of the Eightfold Path, the perception of wilderness and of human beings falls away. Dispassionate mindfulness of the earth arises. The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of the perception of the earth. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of earth. Just as a bull's hide is stretched free of wrinkles with many stakes, mindfulness, metaphor for mindfulness, free of distraction to the ridges and hollows, the rivers and oceans, the trees and stumps and brambles, the craggy irregularities of the earth, non-distraction based solely on the perception of the earth, meaning free of discriminating thoughts, it is now understood that this perception is empty of a permanent human being. That's a long way to go to saying you're not identifying now with the earth. You don't notice all and create identities and all the different irregularities and the beautiful valleys and the high peaks. It's simply the earth. And in that way, there's no connection to something that even as permanent as the earth, it is also impermanent and it's always changing. And creating an identity to the environment being a certain way is setting ourselves up for confusion, deluded thinking, and ongoing disappointment. And again, a simple way of saying is we stop identifying with the earth. Took it from the local environment, now he's taking it out to our planet. Does anybody, do you understand the importance of doing that, or the value in doing that? It's simply another way of creating an identity, isn't it? While we're having a human life, we're going to be living on the earth whether we attach ourselves to it or not. We don't need to create an identity over it. Is that clear? I hope. The Buddha concludes that little segment with saying, now there is only the non-emptiness of the perception of the earth. Let me go on to the next segment. Furthermore, Ananda, as concentration increases within the framework of the Eightfold Path, the perception of wilderness and of human beings and of the earth falls away. Dispassionate mindfulness of the dimension of the infinitude of space arises. The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of the dimension of the infinitude of space. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of space. The mind is expanding now, isn't it? Notice, and this is my words, notice that the local self-referential identification lessens. I left out an important word. Notice that as local self-referential identification lessens, perceptual spaciousness increases. So now where I was only so concerned in this confining place of Frenchtown, New Jersey, I've expanded my mind out. I'm not so stuck on what's occurring to me right here, right now. And I'm now able to gain a perception of a broader picture of my life, first with the earth, and now with the infinitude of space. Is that clear now how that I'm developing spaciousness in my thoughts, but there's still some self-identification there?
You know, I find that when I look at things that disturb me from a wider perspective, the disturbance falls away.
Always.
I can see its relationships and I can see why it's there.
Yes, because you change your perspective from that local perspective.
Whether I like it or not like it,
yeah,
to this is what's there. And, you know, it helps, you know, being a history freak, it helps to kind of know its history, but in the end, you just all of a sudden see the relationships that have concluded in this thing that's right in front of you.
Yeah, you're broadening your view. The Buddha continues, it is now understood that whatever disturbances that would arise based on the perception of wilderness or human beings or of the earth do not arise. The mind is empty of these perceptions. You're seeing them differently. It's only the non-emptiness of the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of space. The quality of mind is regarded as empty of what is not there, meaning you understand clearly that you're not attached to anything anymore. This is further entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and undistorted and pure. My words, concentration and non-clinging have brought a deepening calm. The meditator has not physically left the initial environment, but their mind is increasingly empty of disturbance. Do you see how this is progressing? Through lack of self-identification, through lack of clinging, through emptying yourself of clinging. You're establishing an environment, a quality of mind that is empty of clinging to anything, beginning with what's right in front of us and now expanding out. Furthermore, the Buddha's words, furthermore, Ananda, as concentration increases within the framework of the Eightfold Path, the perception of wilderness and of human beings and of the earth and of the dimension of infinitude of space falls away. Dispassionate mindfulness of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness arises. The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness. Now, we're expanding even more, aren't we? But pay attention to where the Buddha is going to end up with this, because it really brings us all the way back to what's most important. It is now understood that whatever disturbances that would arise based on the perception of wilderness or human beings or of the earth or the dimension of the infinitude of space do not arise. Doesn't mean that the world is annihilated. It means there's no longer any possibility of I-making in any of these situations. The mind is empty of these perceptions. There is only the non-emptiness of the perception of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness. The quality of mind is regarded as not there. This is further entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and is undistorted and is pure. Now, remember when I started this talk, I mentioned about the teachings of Alara Kalama and Udeka Ramaputta and how they taught these so-called advanced teachings. One was gaining this quality of mind of nothingness, and the Udeka Ramaputta was to develop this quality of mind of neither perception nor non-perception, and these were held out as spiritual teachings during the Buddha's time and now. You'll see that now the Buddha is relating these things that seemingly are expansive are nothing more than ignorant attachments. There's nothing grand, mystical. There's nothing here to chase after these so-called higher levels.
Or probably what they said was highest levels.
The highest levels. They're what the Buddha is, and you'll see it in just a moment. What the Buddha is teaching is these conceptual higher planes of consciousness are simply rooted in ignorance, and we establish them through I-making, and that I-making is rooted in ignorance. All right, let me continue so we can get to it. Furthermore, Ananda, as concentration increases within the framework of the Eightfold Path, the perception of wilderness and of human beings and of earth and of the dimension of the infinitude of space and the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness falls away. This passionate mindfulness of the dimension of nothingness arises. The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of the dimension of nothingness. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of the dimension of nothingness. It is now understood that whatever disturbances that would arise based on the perception of wilderness, human beings, earth, dimension of the infinitude of space, or the infinitude of consciousness do not arise. The mind is empty of these perceptions. There is only the non-emptiness of the perception of the dimension of nothingness. The quality of mind is regarded as empty of what is not there. So we're establishing so-called higher levels of consciousness as a repository for the self. Do you see where that I-making is in this? We want to finish it. This is further entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and is undistorted and pure. It may seem like the Buddha is teaching that we should strive to establish ourselves in these mind states. Wait. Furthermore, Ananda, as concentration increases within the framework of the Eightfold Path, the perception of wilderness and of human beings and of the earth and of the dimension of the infinitude of space and of the dimension of the infinitude of consciousness and of the dimension of nothingness falls away. All of it falls away. This passionate mindfulness of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception arises. This is a teaching from Udeka Ramaputta. The mind takes pleasure and finds satisfaction in being mindful of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. The mind quiets and delights in the perception of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. Again, these are teachings that are still taught today as planes of consciousness that we should aspire to. It is now understood that whatever disturbances would arise based on the perception of wilderness, I'm not going to go through that whole list again. The quality of mind is regarded as empty of what is not there. This is further entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality and is undistorted and pure. Just as an explanation, the quality of mind is regarded as empty of what is not there. Concentration and refined mindfulness have developed to the point where the recognition of equanimity is realized. Is that clear? So this is the development of a mind resting in equanimity. Liz?
So in other words, it's so by accepting the spaciousness, you're getting rid of everything else that was sort of clinging. That it's not annihilation, but it's an emptiness that's the result of the skillful use of the Dhamma.
Yes. And all of these different stages are not, again, they're not to be seen as higher states of consciousness.
Right.
Every single one of them, beginning in the localized view, are mental fabrications. The second chain in dependent origination, from ignorance come mental fabrications. That's what the Buddha is describing here. And excuse me for all the long words, but the repetition here is important.
So,
These are simply fabricated mind states. There's nothing of any value there.
so Lauren and I had this experience, I'm sure it was different, but it was a similar kind of experience of being in a meditative state and being sort of free of thoughts, and it wasn't necessarily a pleasant experience. What this is saying is that fear that spaciousness, that spaciousness is a result of the skillful use of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, which creates space. I see it as space in your head.
It is. It's a good way to look at
Space
it.
in your way of thinking, so that you don't have all these other little things going on, and you're in a state of equanimity because other things aren't arising.
Yes, that spaciousness means that there's actually space between your thoughts. It's not one thought immediately following the next thought, immediately following the next thought. That's what a self-referential ego self has to do to continue to maintain its wrong views. It has to establish itself in every thought that occurs. And it becomes a constant process of maintaining or continually to become ignorant. It has to be, it needs that kind of attention. That's why we talk about a monkey mind. A mind just can't slow down. It's because of that self-referential view that always needs to establish itself. So there's spaciousness in our thoughts as we start to develop concentration. Just to touch on that, because you mentioned it again, initially when we in meditation, free of thoughts, it can seem pretty scary. And it's only because it's unfamiliar. That falls away pretty quickly as you continue to develop it. It's just an unfamiliar quality of mind. My words, the dimensions of fabricated mind states of nothingness and of neither perception nor non-perception were studied by the Buddha from his early teachers, and that's what he's referring to here. He's using what he found out that it wasn't to now teach his students. Okay, so here we go. Finally, Ananda, having abandoned the perceptions of the dimension of nothingness, abandoned it because we recognize now that even those so-called exalted states are rooted in ignorance. Finally, Ananda, having abandoned the perceptions of the dimensions of nothingness and the perceptions of the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception, single-minded concentration. The whole point of the Buddha's teachings of meditation is to deepen concentration. But we first have to go through, and we could use these exalted mind states of nothingness and neither perception nor non-perception as metaphor for trying to achieve anything other than concentration in meditation. In other words, in trying to achieve some so-called exalted qualities of mind during meditation, they're all just distractions. They're all just conceptual abodes for a self-referential view. I'm going to establish myself in the dimension of nothingness. Isn't that wonderful? Years ago now, you've heard me tell this story, but I got to tell it again because it fits. Oh, some of you haven't heard it. I got a call from a gentleman, lived in Newtown, a year and a half, or maybe 2 years ago. And he had heard of me, I don't know, came across me on the website or something. And I could hear that almost panic in his voice. And he said, I need to talk to you. I heard you, blah, blah, blah. I want to run something by you. He said, I've been a meditator. He said, I'm 38 years old. I'm living the American dream. I got a beautiful house in Newtown. I got the beautiful house, 3 kids, the cars, everything. Great job. He says, and I feel like I got nothing in my life. And I'm already getting an inclination. I said, well, tell me about your meditation practice. Well, I've been doing a certain practice for 20 years now. And in my meditation practice, I'm focusing on nothing, on no self. And I said, tell me that again. He says, in my meditation practice for the last 20 years, I'm focusing on nothing. And I could almost hear the light bulb going off in his head. He said, holy For 20 years, I've been focusing my meditation on nothingness. And that's just what I'm experiencing in my life. We can create mental qualities if we're not have a well-framed meditation practice and looking to just deepen concentration, of creating pretty severe psychoses, can't we? And the Buddha is teaching that. And it's not that we're all going to end up with psychoses if we meditate improperly. We will continue to seek to establish ourselves in these conceptual frameworks of mind states that we're trying to establish, instead of just deepening concentration. And it is in a well-concentrated mind that's able to establish emptiness of ignorance through that well-concentrated mind. Let me just continue the sutta. We're almost done. One abides in single-minded concentration, free of self-referential views. The quality of mind is regarded as empty of what is not there. We know we're not ignorant anymore. There is a satisfied and pleasant abiding. The mind quiets and is gratified in single-minded concentration, free of self-referential views. The Buddha is now referring back to those other so-called states. Those are all rooted in self-referential views. Now the mind is free of it. It's well concentrated. It is understood that this single-minded concentration, free of self-reference, is fabricated and formed through thought. Having abandoned all self-referential views, it is understood that whatever is fabricated and formed through thought is subject to cessation. So even as we're now developing an awakened mind, a mind that is more fully mature, we're able to recognize that it's still a fabricated place that we're in now. And the reason why that's significant is now we won't create any more self-referential views out of it. We won't become enamored at it. We won't look at it as an achievement anymore. We'll simply recognize it as fabricated. Understanding the impermanent nature of all fabrications, the mind is released from the stress of sensuality, from the stress of more eye-making, and from the stress of ignorance. It is understood that the birth of further ignorant views has ended. The integrated life, meaning the life that is developed within a framework of the Eightfold Path, the integrated life has been lived, the path complete. There is nothing left clinging to the world. It is understood that whatever disturbances that arose from the stress of sensuality, from the stress of becoming or eye-making, and from the stress of ignorance is no longer present. We understand that it's no longer present. We recognize the emptiness of ignorance. There is now only the minor disturbance connected to the sixth sense base that is dependent on the body, with life as a condition, meaning the condition of disturbance. There is only the non-emptiness connected with the sixth sense base and dependent on this body, with life as a condition. Again, notice how the Buddha took us from the local environment into these mystical realms of consciousness, and now he's bringing us right back into a well-concentrated mind. All of those other things are the ocean. They're just there to be recognized and abandoned. There is only the non-emptiness connected with the sixth sense base and dependent on this body, with life as a condition. What is not present is understood of what is not present. Whatever remains is understood as what is present. That's such a profound line, it's almost hard, but I will. The Buddha is also talking about now this person well concentrated is not conditioned from his past. This being is not dragging anything with him. He's simply present with what's present. I'm using that generally, he or she is seeing what is being seen, and is hearing only what is heard, and is sensing only what is sensing, is cognizing, thinking about what is only present here. Empty of any type of ignorance that would condition what's occurring in this moment. Whatever remains is understood as what is present. In what is seen, there is only the seen. In what is heard, there is only the heard. What is cognized, there is only the cognized. So Ananda, this final entry into emptiness, which is in accord with reality, is undistorted and pure. Ananda, whoever enters and remains in this emptiness, whether past, present, or future, they all enter into this same emptiness that is undistorted and pure, superior and unsurpassed. They all enter into the same emptiness, meaning they all do so through this framework of the Eightfold Path. Therefore, Ananda, train yourself to enter into the same emptiness that is undistorted and pure, superior and unsurpassed. This is what the Buddha said, and Ananda was delighted in his words at the end of that sutta. So next week is the Mahasanada Sutta, which goes into a lot less detail. It's not greater in that sense. And excuse me for going into all the detail, but it was important, and I even thought about trying to shorten this a little bit. It was important to go down that long, windy, repetitive road, because it points out so clearly what we do in our own consciousness, our own confused thoughts. We get wrapped up in these things, these ideas of acquisition. Even in so-called spiritual practice, we want to acquire certain things. The Buddha described that beautifully, didn't he, in this? All these different mind states, and starting from our local environment. And he brought us all the way back to concentration. Do we want to empty ourselves of ignorance? Sure we do. How do we do it? Through a well-concentrated mind framed by the Eightfold Path. That's the whole point. The whole point of this long class tonight. To be empty of ignorance. Okay, I've talked enough. That's the end of tonight's sutta. It's gotten a little bit late, but is there any questions about tonight's sutta? Any comments? Isabel?
I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm understanding a certain part just because I'm developing the understanding.
Yep.
The one thing you said about, I guess, identifying like with the earth and that concept. So being in so I'm out in the woods today and I look around and I'm present in like its beauty and what's going on around me, but I'm not saying like it has to be beautiful, it has to stay beautiful, yeah. Or like, is that ignorant of me? Am I making by like thinking that this space around me is beautiful? Or is it like clinging on to that it needs to be beautiful? Is that me? I don't know. I'm not really wording this correctly, but.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
It is entirely appropriate to appreciate the beauty that's all around us all the time. It's unskillful to create attachments to it, that's how it's going to be. Yeah. You know, and to say that I'm only going to be happy on sunny days, you set yourself up for disappointment. But I was just talking to someone, maybe that's why I talked about this. He was just vehement. It kind of came out of nowhere that he just can't stand rainy days. Man, you know, that's a tough way to live your life, isn't it? Because they're going to be there. But when we place any of the types of conditions on our life, that's when we're getting ourselves in trouble. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't appreciate.
Like, if I were to place the idea of like I can only find peace within wilderness or within nature,
yeah,
that
you're setting yourself. That's a condition that you're putting on your happiness. And we do that with all types of things. That's a very good example of it, though. That my life has to be a certain way for me to be happy. Because of impermanence, your life is always going to change. No matter how well structured you set yourself up, there's always going to be disappointment. That's the first noble truth. And so we start creating all kinds of self-referential strategies to maintain a life that is only satisfying. Those things that we say are satisfying are permanent. We create identities over it. And that, again, that's a great example. I would tell a story about the green flash, the sunset in Hawaii, but I don't have time. It'll come up again. Frank.
I have to leave. Just want to say goodnight.
Good to see you, my friend. See you, Drew.
I do also. Thanks.
Well, if you want, you can hang around for a minute and we'll just end class. You know, I'm not trying. I'll see you guys. So again, now that I said that, any other questions or comments about tonight's? Okay, we'll finish with Metta. So find your relaxed meditative posture and gently close your eyes and gently close your mouths. And again, take a moment to become aware of the sensation of breathing in your body and let that mindfulness of your breath cease any distracting thoughts to the past or to the future from our talk tonight. And these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing, in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Wonderful class. Peace.